You followed the rules, made better decisions, and somehow it still doesn't feel like progress. Think about this for a second. You get a raise. A real one. Maybe you went from $52,000 a year to $67,000. That's not nothing. That's $15,000 more dollars every single year hitting your account. And for about 2 weeks, maybe 3, you feel good about it. You go out to a nicer dinner. You stop checking your bank balance before every grocery run. You breathe a little easier. And then, quietly, almost without noticing, that feeling disappears. The rent went up. The car needs new tires. A doctor's visit turned into a specialist visit, which turned into a bill you weren't expecting. Groceries keep creeping up. Not dramatically, just enough that you notice the total is always higher than you planned. And here you are, earning more than you ever have, still doing the mental math at the checkout line, still lying awake at 2 a.m. running numbers in your head, still feeling like you're one unexpected expense away from everything going sideways. Here's the thing. That feeling is not irrational. It is not a character flaw. It is not proof that you're bad with money. It is actually one of the most documented, most researched, most misunderstood psychological phenomena in the entire field of behavioral economics. And almost nobody is talking about it the right way. My name is Ely, and I spend way too much time thinking about how people in the US experience money psychologically. If you're someone who earns a normal income, maybe even more than you used to, but still doesn't feel financially secure, hit subscribe and give this video a thumbs up. Because this channel is not about getting rich fast. It is not about stock picks or passive income sideshows. It is about understanding why the stress doesn't go away, why earning more often feels like a disappointment in slow motion, and what you can actually do about it that isn't completely disconnected from your real life. So let's get into it. Here's what most people don't realize when they think about financial stress in this country. The conversation almost always starts in the wrong place. People want to talk about income. They want to say, well, if you make enough, you shouldn't feel stressed. And on paper, that logic seems reasonable. But the data tells a completely different story. The American Psychological Association has been running its Stress in America survey for years. And year after year, money consistently ranks as the top source of stress for Americans. Not just for people in poverty, not just for those earning minimum wage, but across income levels. A significant portion of people earning between $75,000 and $100,000 a year report feeling financially stressed on a regular basis. At $100,000, which most people would consider a solid, respectable income, a meaningful share of households still report living paycheck to paycheck or within one emergency away from financial disruption. The Federal Reserve's own surveys on household economic well-being have echoed this repeatedly. We are not talking about people who are reckless or irresponsible. We are talking about people who did everything they were told to do and still feel like the ground is unstable beneath them. Now you might be thinking, okay, but those people probably just spend too much. And that is exactly the assumption I want to pull apart, because it is lazy, it is incomplete, and frankly it ignores about 40 years of cost increases that have nothing to do with spending habits. Let's run some real numbers. The median household income in the United States right now sits around $74,000 to $76,000, depending on the year and the source. Sounds workable, right? But here's where the math gets uncomfortable. Take a household in a mid-sized American city. Nothing coastal, nothing flashy, somewhere like Columbus, Ohio, or Charlotte, North Carolina, or Tucson, Arizona. Rent for a 2-bedroom apartment in those cities runs anywhere from $1,400 to $1,900 a month. Call it $1,600. That's $19,200 a year just for a roof. The Bureau of Labor Statistics tells us that the average American household spends over $10,000 a year on transportation, car payment, insurance, gas, maintenance, registration. Healthcare costs for a family, even with employer-sponsored insurance, regularly run several $1,000s a year in premiums alone before you count deductibles, copays, or prescriptions. Groceries for a family of 4 have climbed to well over $1,000 a month in many markets. Add utilities, phone, internet, things that are not luxuries anymore. They are requirements for functioning in modern life. And you are already somewhere between $50,000 and $60,000 a year in basic, non-negotiable expenses. Before a single dollar of fun. Before a vacation. before retirement savings, before a child's activity, before anything that makes life feel like it's worth living. This is where it gets interesting, because when the math is that tight, the brain does not just register stress as a temporary inconvenience. It registers it as a threat, and that distinction matters enormously. There is a body of research going back to work by economists Sindel Mullainathan and Eldar Shaffer on what they call scarcity mindset. The core idea is this: when people feel like they do not have enough, whether that's money, time, or any finite resource, the brain tunnel focuses. It becomes extraordinarily good at solving the immediate problem in front of it, and significantly worse at everything else. Planning, self-control, long-term thinking, all of it takes a hit, not because the person is weak or lazy, but because cognitive bandwidth is genuinely limited and financial stress consumes a disproportionate amount of it. Here's the metaphor that I think captures it best. Imagine your mental capacity as a laptop with a fixed amount of RAM. Financial anxiety is like running a massive background program that never closes. It is constantly using processing power. So when you sit down to make a budget, to think about your retirement, to evaluate whether you should switch jobs or negotiate a raise, you are trying to do all of that on a machine that is already working overtime on something else. The output suffers. And then people look at that output, the impulsive decisions, the avoidance, the financial paralysis, and they say, "See, that person is bad with money." When really, the stress itself is impairing the decision-making. This is not an excuse. It is a mechanism. And understanding the mechanism is what actually lets you start working around it. Now look, this brings us to something that I think is one of the most quietly devastating forces in American financial psychology. And it is not your rent. It is not even the healthcare system, as brutal as that is. It is comparison. Specifically, the way constant, ambient social comparison distorts your ability to feel stable even when you objectively are. The research here is pretty striking. Studies have consistently shown that people's satisfaction with their income is heavily influenced not just by the absolute amount, but by how it compares to those around them. This goes back to a concept called relative income, and economists have been writing about it since at least the 1940s. But here is what those older studies could not account for: social media. The way we experience comparison now is historically unprecedented. For most of human history, your reference group was limited to maybe a few hundred people you could actually see in your daily life. Now it's millions, and the comparison is not happening against average people living average lives. It is happening against the curated, optimized, highlight reel versions of the most aspirational moments in other people's lives. So you are earning $72,000 a year. By any historical standard, by any global standard, that is a lot of money. But your feed is full of people your age who appear to be taking international trips twice a year, renovating their homes, driving newer cars, and talking casually about building generational wealth. And your nervous system does not process that intellectually. It processes it emotionally. It registers it as falling behind, as not enough, as evidence that something is wrong with you specifically. That registration, that feeling of quiet inadequacy, is not weakness. It is a neurological response to a stimulus that your brain was never designed to handle at this scale. And it has a direct impact on financial behavior, because when we feel behind, we often make spending decisions designed to feel caught up. A purchase that is a little beyond what is comfortable. A vacation that goes on a card. An upgrade that felt necessary in the moment and regrettable within weeks. Not because we are irresponsible, but because the emotional pressure of visible comparison creates a kind of spending that is really social signaling dressed up as lifestyle choice. Here's the thing though, there is another layer to this that almost nobody talks about. Even people who are not particularly influenced by social media. People who genuinely do not care what their neighbors drive or what their coworkers earn still feel this. And that is because some of the stress is not about comparison at all. It is about safety, or more specifically, about the particular way that financial safety works in the United States, where the margin between stability and crisis is structurally thinner than in almost any other wealthy country in the world. Think about this. If you are a median income earner in Germany, France, Canada, or Australia, your healthcare costs are dramatically lower and more predictable. Higher education, if your kids want it, does not come with six-figure debt attached. Your retirement system is more robust. Job loss comes with stronger, longer-lasting support. None of these things are free. Taxes are higher, but the point is that the floor is higher. The catastrophe scenarios are less catastrophic, which means a middle-income person in those countries can afford, psychologically, to feel more secure with the same or even a lower income. In the United States, the floor is lower and the drop is steeper. A single health emergency can cost tens of thousands of dollars, even with insurance. A job loss can mean losing healthcare immediately. A car that breaks down can interrupt the ability to get to work in cities where public transit is inadequate. The margin for error is genuinely smaller. And when your brain senses that margin is small, it stays in threat response mode even when the immediate numbers look okay. This is not neurotic. This is accurate threat assessment. And it is a big part of why financial anxiety in this country is not something that just goes away when income rises. Now you might be thinking, okay, Ely, this is all very interesting and mildly depressing, but what am I supposed to do with it? Fair. Let's talk about that. The first thing, and I mean the absolute foundation, is separating emotional financial experience from factual financial position. These are two different things, and most people spend their entire lives treating them as the same. Your emotional experience of your finances is shaped by comparison, by memory, by fear, by social pressure, by the structural anxiety of living in a low safety net society. Your factual position is just the numbers. What comes in? What goes out? What stays? Most people cannot clearly see either one because the emotions are so loud that the facts get blurry. So the practice here, and it sounds almost too simple, is to actually look at the numbers without any judgment attached. Not as a reflection of your worth or your intelligence or your discipline, just as information. Many people who feel broke are not actually broke. They have income that could, with some structural changes, create meaningful breathing room. And many people who feel fine are quietly underwater. The feeling is not the map. It is important data, but it is not the map. The second thing is to get extremely clear on your personal financial floor, not your aspirational budget, not the number you need to feel comfortable or respected or on track by someone else's definition. Your actual floor, the number that covers everything that keeps your life running without crisis. Rent, food, transportation, utilities, minimum debt payments, healthcare out of pocket. That number. Because here's what happens when you are not clear on it. Your brain stays anxious indefinitely because it has no target to aim at. No clear threshold that represents, okay, right now, in this moment, I am not in danger. And anxiety without a target becomes free-floating dread, which is exhausting and, more importantly, financially paralyzing. When you know your floor, you can start asking a different question. Instead of do I have enough, which almost no one ever answers yes to, the question becomes, am I above my floor right now? And if yes, what is the distance between where I am and where I want to be? And what is the smallest possible first step? That reframe sounds modest. It is not. It is the difference between chronic paralysis and incremental motion. The third thing is to be extremely deliberate about your reference group. Not moralistic about it. Not, I should not look at social media, because that is not realistic advice, but genuinely intentional. The question to ask is, who am I measuring myself against and why? Because if the answer is people who appear to be doing better than me, that reference group will always produce anxiety regardless of your income, regardless of your net worth, regardless of your actual progress. The reference group that actually serves you is your own trajectory. Are you doing better than you were doing 2 years ago, 3 years ago, even slightly? That is the data that matters. That is the comparison that produces useful information instead of just cortisol. There is also something important to be said about the lifestyle expansion trap, which is what economists call lifestyle inflation, and what most of us just experience as somehow I make more and still have nothing left. The mechanism is simple. When income goes up, spending has a remarkable tendency to go up in lockstep. And not because people are reckless, because new income usually comes with new context. A better job often means a nicer neighborhood where rent is higher. More income means you can afford the car payment you couldn't before. A raise often coincides with a stage of life where expenses are naturally growing. Kids, aging parents, home ownership. The raise gets absorbed before it ever had a chance to create distance. The intervention here is not to never spend more as you earn more. That's not realistic, and it is not even the goal. The goal is intentional allocation before the money disappears. The concept that works best for most people is not a detailed, category-by-category budget that takes 2 hours a month to maintain. It is a simpler architecture. Before the paycheck gets spent on anything, a fixed amount, even a small one, even $100 or $200, moves somewhere that makes it slightly harder to access and slightly easier to leave alone. A separate savings account, an automatic transfer, something that requires a small amount of friction to reverse. Because it turns out that friction is a surprisingly powerful force in financial behavior. When spending requires effort, spending decreases. When saving is automatic, saving happens. None of this is glamorous. None of it is going to make a highlight reel. But it is what actually works for ordinary people living ordinary incomes in an economy that is legitimately difficult to navigate. Here's where I want to land this, because I think the most important thing I can say is this. The feeling that you described at the beginning of this video, the one where you're doing everything roughly right and it still doesn't feel like progress, that feeling is not proof that you are failing. It is proof that you are navigating something that is genuinely hard, in a country where the structural difficulty is real, and in a cultural environment that is specifically designed to make you feel like you are always behind. The answer is not to feel better by buying more. It is not to grind harder until some threshold magically produces the feeling of safety. The answer is to understand what is actually happening in your own mind and in your own numbers clearly enough to stop reacting and start choosing. Choosing what your floor is. Choosing your reference group. Choosing where your next dollar goes before the environment chooses for you. These are not dramatic gestures. They are small, consistent acts of financial self-determination in a context that makes those acts harder than they should be. And that is worth something, even when it doesn't feel like it yet. If this video gave you something to think about, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. There is a lot more to talk about. The psychology of debt avoidance, why budgeting feels like punishment, how identity gets tangled up in spending in ways that make change feel threatening. All of it. We're going to get into all of it. For now, take a breath. Look at your actual numbers, not your emotional experience of them. And give yourself credit for paying attention. That part matters more than most people realize. See you in the next one.